Welcome to the Daily Decameron, Tales to Connect Us in Troubled Times. Episode 4, The Pirate King. Today, a tale of fate, fortunes lost and found, and adventure on the high seas. The late Middle Ages saw the rise of a wealthy merchant class in Italy, traders who imported and exported goods, taking outsized risks that could bring them vast fortunes or plunge them into ruin. Reigning over a new middle ground between noble and commoner, these self-made kings of commerce, like the hero of our story, Landolfo Rufolo, were the celebrity millionaires of their day, their fortunes and failures inspiring endless fascination. And Boccaccio, himself the son of a merchant, was as fascinated with their stories as anyone. He likely based Landolfo on Lorenzo Rufolo, the scion of a prosperous family from Ravello, a town perched on a cliffside high above the Amalfi coast. Boccaccio was among the first writers to put Ravello on the map, and ever since, it's been a playground of the rich and a haven for bohemians, writers, and artists, including D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, André Gide, Virginia Woolf, Salvador Dali, M.C. Escher, Truman Capote, and Gore Vidal. The real-life Villa Rufolo, which would have been Landolfo's ancestral home, still stands at the edge of town, astonishing visitors with its jaw-dropping garden overlooking the sea. When Wagner visited Ravello in 1880, it was this very spot that inspired the magical garden of Klingsor in his opera Parsifal, and it's now the site of an annual music festival created in his honor. It's easy to understand why Landolfo longed to return home to this enchanted place, and how its celestial beauty might have inspired both his lust for wealth and his ultimate redemption. Seconda giornata, novella quarta, Landolfo Rufolo. The second day, the fourth novella, the tale of Landolfo Rufolo. The stretch of land above Salerno, overlooking the sea, is one of the most delightful in all of Italy. A string of lovely villages filled with gardens and fountains the locals call the Amalfi Coast. Among these towns, there is one called Ravello, which is home to many wealthy merchants, and one of these, Landolfo Rufolo, was among the very wealthiest of them all. But Landolfo was not satisfied with what he had, and he decided he would not rest until he had doubled his fortune. He bought a large ship, loaded it with goods of all kinds, and set sail for the island of Cyprus. But when he got there, he found the port already filled with ships carrying the very same goods he had brought. Forced to sell off his cargo at a great loss, he suddenly found himself on the verge of ruin. Plunged into despair, Landolfo thought of taking his own life, but decided instead to turn to a life of crime. He sold his ship and bought a smaller one that was light and nimble and perfectly suited for piracy. Fitting it out with arms and a crew, he took to the sea in search of trading ships. Landolfo turned out to have even more success as a pirate than he had ever had as a merchant, and within a year he had plundered so many ships that he not only made back all that he had lost, but more than doubled his original fortune, just as he had set out to do. This, he told himself, was enough. Longing for home, he loaded his treasures into the hold of the little ship that had brought him such great riches, and set sail, oars at full speed, for Ravello. But one evening, as he was passing through the archipelago, a sirocco wind began to blow, and his little ship was no match for the rough seas. As luck would have it, he saw a small island with a sheltered inlet, and it was there that he headed to wait out the storm. But before long, 2 large Genoese merchant galleys, returning from Constantinople, arrived at the same inlet. Recognizing at once the ship of the notorious pirate Landolfo, and knowing how wealthy he must be, they decided to seize the vessel and whatever treasures they might find on board. Some of their crew they sent ashore, armed with crossbows, to block Landolfo's men from fleeing toward land. The rest set out in rowboats from the other side, and, with the current favoring them, quickly arrived alongside Landolfo's ship and easily captured the vessel and its crew. They seized Landolfo and took him, dressed only in an old jacket, on board one of their ships. And then they plundered all the precious cargo from his ship and sank it. The next day, the winds having calmed, the 2 Genoese galleys set sail toward the west. But as night drew near, another gale began to blow, and in the dark, stormy seas the ships were separated. The one on which the miserable Landolfo was being held captive was blown toward the island of Cephalonia, and suddenly, with a terrible crash, it struck a sandbar and was smashed to pieces like a glass thrown against a wall. Tossed into the swells in the pitch-black night, the crew flailed in desperation, reaching out to grasp whatever debris from the shipwreck happened to float by. Seeing a plank bobbing in the water, Landolfo straddled it and held on as best he could, tossed by the waves and the wind, until daybreak, hoping against hope that God might spare him. As the sun came up, he could see nothing but sea and sky, and then he spied a wooden chest bobbing on the waves and floating menacingly in his direction. Fearful that the chest would strike him, he tried to push it away with what little strength he had left. But a sudden gust of wind flung the chest forward, tossing Landolfo beneath the waves. Fueled more by fear than strength, he came up swimming, and seeing his plank floating far off in the distance, he swam toward the chest, flung his body over its lid, and held on as best he could. And so, tossed about by the waves, without a thing to eat, and far more to drink than he would have wished for, he floated helplessly all that day and all the following night. The next morning, Landolfo, still clinging to the chest, and so thoroughly soaked he thought he might be turning into a sponge, was brought by the winds, or perhaps by the will of God, to the coast of the island of Corfu. On the shore, a poor woman was scrubbing her laundry in the sand and seawater. Seeing a strange dark shape drifting toward her, she started to run away, screaming in terror. Landolfo was so weak he could neither speak nor see, but as the current pulled him toward the shore, the woman began to recognize the shape of a chest, and then an arm, and finally the face of a man. Overcome with compassion, she ran into the water, waded out to Landolfo, grabbed him by the hair, and dragged him onto dry land. When she could finally pry the man from the chest, she carried both to her house in the village, where she put Landolfo in a warm bath and gave him a sound scrubbing until some of his color and strength had returned. The good woman fed Landolfo and brought him wine, and under her watchful care, he soon recovered and began to understand who and where he was. After several days, the woman knew the time had come to send him back out into the world on his own, and, telling him this, she brought him the chest to take with him on his journey. Landolfo had no recollection of it at all, but he accepted it, thinking that, though it probably had no value, he might somehow be able to get a few days' living expenses out of whatever might be inside. But taking it in his hands and feeling how light it was, his hopes were greatly diminished. The woman left the room, and the minute she was gone, Landolfo pried the chest open. To his amazement, he found that it was filled to the brim with precious stones, some loose and some in settings. Being an expert in gemstones, he knew at once that they were of enormous value, and, his spirits greatly lifted, he thanked God for this miraculous intervention. But having been buffeted by fortune so fiercely, not once, but twice, and wary of a third time, Landolfo knew he must be very careful in bringing these jewels back home safely. So he wrapped them in some old rags and told the woman he no longer needed the chest, and he would give it to her in exchange for a simple sack, an offer she accepted with pleasure. Landolfo thanked her for all she had done for him, and throwing the sack over his back, he set off for home. He boarded a ship heading for Brindisi, and from there traveled along the coast to Trani, where he ran into some textile merchants whom he knew from his hometown. He told them about all his misadventures, well, everything but the part about the chest, and taking pity on him, they fitted him out with a suit of splendid new clothing, lent him a horse, and found him an escort to guide him back to Ravello. Safely back at home, Landolfo opened his sack, and examining the stones more carefully than he had the first time he saw them, he realized that they were of such high quality that even if he sold them at a modest price, he would, indeed, be twice as rich as he was when he had set out from home. As soon as he had sold a few of them, he sent a large sum of money to Corfu as a gesture of gratitude for the good woman who had dragged him from the sea and saved his life. And he did likewise to the merchants who had given him clothing in Trani. The rest he kept for himself, and, never again tempted to practice the trade of a merchant, much less that of a pirate, Landolfo Rufolo lived honestly and splendidly all the rest of his life. Thanks for listening to The Daily Decameron, a production of the Italian Cultural Institute of San Francisco. Annamaria Di Giorgio, director. This program was produced by Franca Cavallaro and edited by Enrica Cavalli, with music performed by John Sayles. I'm your host and translator, Steve Siegelman. We hope you'll join us for more episodes in both English and Italian. Meanwhile, stay well, stay connected, and share your favorite stories with the people you love.